Morning everyone. Thanks for joining us today. So we're on a number 14 of our EUDR working group, which I don't think we expected to get as high with that number. Thanks for joining us for this meeting again. The aim of the meeting is always to kind of come together throughout the trade and collaborate on ideas, suggestions, and try resolve issues that we're all having and clarify things. A quick reminder, we're meeting as part of Timber Development UK, the Responsible Sourcing Committee. So there's just a reminder on the Competitions Act. We don't talk about sensitive market information or share information like that. If you think anything's delving into that area, just let me know. So we've got Zhao joining us, who is for TDUK, who has arranged this meeting and continues to do all the work in facilitating and knitting everything together. And then I'm Joe Walsh. I chair the Responsible Sourcing Subcommittee, working for Anson Plywood through the day. So today we've got Preferred by Nature joining us. So we've got Timothy and David here, and they're going to just go through a presentation and share current state of affairs with EUDR in general. There will be opportunity for a question and answer through their presentation. But if you've got anything that pops up and you want to get it out of your system, put it into the chat and we can approach it when we get a second. Tim, David, I don't know if you want to take the floor.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Joe. And Xiao, you can hear me okay? And thanks to everyone for joining today, basically. I'm sorry? Yes. Okay. Just a little bit on Preferred by Nature, just very, very quickly. We don't have a slide here, just to say that we are a non-profit organization. We are now just over 30 years old. We work to support better land management and business practices that benefit people, nature, and the climate. So we do that basically through 4 pillars, if you like, of activity. Certification. We are a certification body as well as a scheme developer as well. We have our own certification scheme. We provide advisory services to companies. We develop mission-driven projects, and we're quite engaged in sort of capacity building globally. I think we now maybe about between 300 and 400 staff members globally, with our headquarters in Denmark. And we have a focus, if you like, or a strategic focus in forestry and agriculture. So maybe Tim and I, we can just present ourselves if you don't know us already. I'm David Hadley. I lead a small unit in Preferred by Nature that we call Regulatory Impact, and we really just have a set of objectives. We've been functioning since 2023. We try to keep stakeholders informed about key policies and regulations that impact them, that are relevant to the sustainability sector. And kind of internally, and part of the work that we do internally is try to make sure that Preferred by Nature itself is developing and has the right types of tools, guidance, and services in line with our mission and our strategy to support our stakeholders to either meet regulations if it relates to compliance, or just for those that are impacted by such, regulations like the EUDR, that they also have tools and support. And then finally, where we can, we don't have an advocacy arm as such, but we do try to support the development and implementation of practical and impactful legislation. Tim.
Thanks. Just checking, you can see the screen that I'm sharing, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. My name is Timothy Bender. So yes, I'm part of the regulatory impact team. I work specifically a lot with the EUDR. I work on developing tools, trainings, guidances, which we make publicly available. And I also support our advisory unit, where we support companies in anything responsible sourcing related, and specifically EUDR implementation. I think that's just short on me.
Let's go to the next slide. Uh, just a very quick overview, really. We will give a little bit on basically this topic is the amendments to the EUDR. We won't cover just a recap or anything of the regulation. We assume that probably most people have that. So we look at just the background to the amendments, timelines and scope in terms of changes to those, obligations of micro and small primary operators, revised obligations for downstream actors in general. We've got a few slides really just to kind of go a bit further on just what preferred by nature does itself to support companies. That's just very, very quick. And then, just Q&A and or discussion at the end in terms of, I'm sure many of you have sort of questions and have come up with topics already. Yeah, so I don't know if Tim, you want to say anything here. Some of you may be aware, as preferred by nature, we gave a presentation online yesterday through one of our webinars on the amendments as well. And to a large extent, so we're drawing heavily from that presentation of yesterday. We're basically covering the same ground. That was a little more commodity agnostic and, for all types of stakeholders. So we've hopefully tried to tailor where we can, some of our discussion points to the UK and to the timber as the target commodity.
Yeah, just
go
quickly
ahead.
add to that. We'll be, like David said, doing mostly the same as we did yesterday. That recording is also available. We'll likely be going less into detail on some parts, which are maybe less applicable to UK companies. But at the end, we have an additional part which we didn't cover yesterday, where we just go into a specific scenario of products leaving the EU to companies within the UK, for example, and then re-entering. Yeah, I think that's it.
Yeah, we obviously try to be conscious of the fact that the range of companies within Timber Development UK is such that there are companies with entities, obviously, and activities very much in Europe, and so it's really, to some extent, just adding additional observations rather than taking anything away. But let's proceed. So, just a little bit first on the background, timelines, and scope. I will speak to this, and then maybe Tim will pick up on a second section, and then we'll just discuss together at the end. So, of course, this presentation is focusing on the amendments adopted in relation to the regulation. For those of you not following EU policy developments so closely, I will just recap a little bit how we got here. So, as I'm sure you're all aware, the EU deforestation regulation came into force in 2023. In June of 2023, it was, however, it already has been amended. It was amended in December of 2024. But at that time, the amendments were kind of quite limited and specific to really just dates, including dates of application, so that the regulation itself was delayed for the first time. What happened in the second half of 2025? In October 2025, the Commission presented a legislative proposal to amend the regulation, to amend the EUDR, aiming to allow more time for system readiness and compliance. But clearly, if you've been following, these developments, taking an opportunity to simplify some elements of the regulation, also from a point of view of administrative burden, if you like. This is part of, there's a lot of this type of activity happening at the level of the EU across many different sectors. In November 2025, so it all happened really quite quickly, the Council adopted its own mandate in response to the Commission's proposal, and then the European Parliament followed suit a few days later on the 26th of November, basically adopting the Commission's proposal as well, but with some amendments. So when there's three different versions, what happens is the EU institutions come together and they try to hammer out one single version of the law or version of this amending regulation. That's called trilogue. And that's what they did. And so in very early December, trilogue concluded with a provisional agreement, a single version of the amending regulation. That then still has to go back and be adopted by the Council and the European Parliament. That happened. The co-legislators agreed finally by it's sort of later in December, and then on the 23rd of December 2025, this amending regulation was published in the official journal of the EU, basically with immediate effect. So that's what we'll talk about today. If you go to the next slide, this is a little bit, we just wanted to add this slide as a kind of like, okay, we've just been looking back, amending regulation and no amending regulation, just perhaps to have on your radar a bunch of different sort of implementing activities, if you like, that will take place over 2026 that you may want to have on your radars. So I'll just go through some of these. Firstly, the red box on the top left, the amending regulation mandates that the European Commission conducts a simplification review of the EUDR by 30th of April 2026. So we'll discuss that later, but it's possible that there will be a legislative proposal that will come out of that review, but we'll park that for now. Secondly, the Commission plans to review and, as necessary, revise the country benchmark conclusions reached last year. So you'll recall that all countries are categorized as low standard or high risk. That review will be conducted again based on the availability of new FAO data, basically. We don't know, because the original benchmarking process that took place last year was based on FAO Forest Resources Assessment data from 2020. Obviously, they pull in other data sets, but one of the fundamental data sets is this data set from FAO. There's now 2025, the publication in October of 2025, so that they can update the country benchmarks. We don't know when that will happen, but we would certainly hope it would happen as early as possible, no later, if you like, than the middle of this year, in order to allow companies to update their due diligence systems in time for the end of the year, when the regulation becomes enforceable. Third point, you may remember last year in April, the Commission published a draft delegated act introducing what they called targeted and limited fixes to the annex of the EUDR. So in other words, this Annex 1 that relates to the scope, there were sort of exemptions on samples, on second-hand products, things like this. There was a consultation process around that draft delegated act, but the act was never concluded, adopted, and finalized. So the Commission has committed to finalizing that act. What we just don't know is if it will stay in its current form, or if with this review and other things going on, there may be further simplifications that they want to include within it prior to sort of finalizing the process. And then, of course, the two key sort of guidance documents from the Commission, the FAQs and the guidance, they will without doubt be revised at least once. So we would imagine at least one iteration of those documents before the end of the year. So watch this space. Preferred by Nature will try to kind of keep everyone updated on these different developments and let everyone know. And hopefully, if we can dig into them a little bit more, maybe even do a webinar like this if we need to at a later stage. Next slide, Tim. Right, let's talk amendments. So what we see here is just a single slide really of the main changes introduced through the amendments that we'll talk to. We'll go into a little bit more detail for all of these. So a delay in the date of application of the regulation, reduced obligations for downstream and small actors, changes to the product scope, the review I mentioned on further simplification, and a new type of actor with a reduced set of obligations, micro and small primary operators. So next slide. Great, thank you. Yeah, new timelines for implementation. So on the left-hand side, you see basically this slide, the date of June 2023. Of course, that's when the EUDR came into force. The date of application, that's the date when the rules start to apply, has been delayed again by 1 year. So with this most recent amendment, the date has now been moved back to the 30th of December 2026 for medium and large-sized operators, and to the 30th of June 2027 for micro and small operators. So overall, this is just an extension, if you like, of those dates of application by 12 months for all actors. A few things worth noting. The extension of the 6-month period for micro and small operators applies only if the operator was already established as a micro or small organization by the 31st of December 2024. That cutoff date has been modified in the amending regulation. It was previously 31st of December 2020. Secondly, also a reminder, because this has always been the case, this extension does not apply to products which fall under the scope of the EU timber regulation. So for the products that fall under the scope of the EU timber regulation, the date of application remains the 30th of December 2026. Not the set of products which are within the scope of the EUDR is, in summary, it's the scope of the EU timber regulation plus some additional customs codes. And then finally, just to clarify, based on the wording of the amendments, this delay only applies to micro and small operators and not to downstream operators or traders. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that means in future slides. So yeah, great, thanks. So what does this new timeline mean for the EU timber regulation? So of course, the EUTR is the predecessor of the EUDR. That will be repealed once the EUDR enters into application, basically at the end of this year. However, as before, the EUTR continues to apply for another 3 years until now, the 31st of December 2029, but only for products made from timber where the trees were harvested before the 29th of June 2023, when the EUDR came into force. So to illustrate this, we'll look at a few scenarios. Tim, if you want to bring the first one up, just imagine a relevant product that falls within the scope of the EUTR. It's the trees used to manufacture this product were harvested before June 2023. In this scenario, the same product, or that product I should say, is placed on the market before the EUDR becomes applicable, basically before the end of this year. And in this case, obviously the EUDR does not apply. The product remains subject to the requirements of the EU timber regulation. In a second scenario, the product is then placed on the EU market, but after the EUDR's date of application, so after the end of this year, but before 31st of December 2029, here the EUDR also does not apply. Instead, the product remains subject to the EU timber regulation. And then a final scenario, the same product is placed on the market after 31st of December 2029. In this case, the transitional period has ended and the EUDR applies. So next slide. Review for simplification, right? So everyone's asking this question, Shao. I don't know. You may want to jump in if you have some further information here, but just to set the scene. So one of the additions to the amending regulation concerns a requirement, an obligation for the Commission to carry out a further review of the EUDR, focusing on opportunities for further simplification. The Commission has a requirement, has a deadline, such that by the end of the 30th of April, or so by 30th of April, I should say, 2026, it must present a report to the European Parliament and the Council of the European Union on this matter, and that report be accompanied by a legislative proposal if it's deemed necessary. In other words, if it's deemed that it is necessary to include some additional legislative text in order to address some of those simplification measures, then so be it. The scope of the report needs to focus particularly on micro and small operators. Our question is whether there will be additional legislation proposed, or whether any simplification opportunities which are identified will just be made through other ways. And these could be, for example, through just additional measures included within the FAQ and the guidance, or additional clarifications in those documents, improvements to the information system, for example, or perhaps a delegated or an implementing act in accordance with the powers that the Commission has. So delegated and implemented acts within sort of the EU system, they don't require to go through the Parliament and the Council. These are effectively actions that the Commission themselves can take. They're of a technical nature, and it's where they're sort of adding some of the detail as to how the regulation will be implemented. One final note, and correct me if I'm wrong here, Xiao, we understand that there will not be any dedicated public call for evidence in relation to the simplification review, as there have been for other simplification processes. That's not to stop organizations or stakeholders submitting questions or comments. So there is a period right now in which, until the end of this month, in which different organizations are doing that, but there's no kind of open public call for evidence or information associated with this review. Next slide, Tim. And finally, my last slide for the moment is just an amendment affecting the product scope of the EUDR. So products classified under Chapter 49 of the combined nomenclature have been excluded, meaning that printed materials are now outside of the scope of the regulation. Chapter 49 includes most printed materials, such as printed books, brochures, leaflets, newspapers, maps, plans, manuscripts, printed advertising material, catalogs, flyers, pamphlets, and similar. I think yesterday we had a few questions on that question. Let's see if they come up today as well. But over to you, Tim, I think now.
Thanks, David. So I will now be talking a little bit about the specific changes and obligations to both downstream operators and traders, but also a new category or a new role under the EUDR, the small and micro and small primary operators. And before I get into those specific obligations, just a quick reminder of the roles that already existed and remain unchanged. So we have the operator, which is an entity that is placing a relevant product on the EU market or exporting it. So this would be an EU importer who's placing on the market, or it could be an EU-based producer, or now also called primary operator, so an EU-based forest or farm owner. And then, of course, an operator can be an exporter if the EU producer is the entity that is exporting the product before or instead of placing them on the EU market. Then we have the trader, and the trader is any entity that is making available a relevant product on the EU market. And just a reminder here of what the difference is between making available and placing on the market. Making available means the supply for distribution, use, or consumption. as part of a commercial activity within the EU. And then placing a relevant product on the market is just the first time it's being made available. So an example for a trader would be an EU-based retailer, someone who buys a relevant product that has already been placed on the EU market and then sells that product on the EU market without any changes being made to the product. Then we have the downstream operator. This actor already existed before the amendments, but has only now been formally defined as this specific role. So we've always been referring to this actor as the downstream operator. In the past, the Commission would just refer to this as an operator further down the supply chain. Now it's formally defined. It's again an entity placing a relevant product on the market or exporting, but for which the products are covered by a due diligence statement reference number. So this is again a product that has already been placed on the EU market at some point or exported. And an example for this would be manufacturers. So an EU-based company which buys a relevant product that has already been placed on the EU market, changes this into a new product and then sells it again. So the classic example is the chocolate producer who buys cocoa powder and other ingredients and then creates the chocolate bar, which is a new product. And of course, downstream operators can be exporters. Then we have a completely newly defined role, the micro and small, or I'm not sure if it's micro and small, primary operator. As the name already implies, this role is tied specifically to the size of the company. So this company needs to be either micro in size or small. They also need to be established in a low-risk country. And it's specifically stated that a micro and small primary operator can also exist outside of the EU. Beyond the size and the location, they also need to be a primary operator, which means they are a producer, so they harvest, grow, or raise, in the case of cattle, the relevant product themselves. And then they either place it on the EU market or they export it from the EU market. Yes, so I just want to, so before I get into the obligations of the micro and small primary operator, they threw in this clause relating to when can a company be classified as a micro and small primary operator. We see here on the slide the thresholds that are defined by the EUDR, or in this case, they refer to a different EU directive which sets out these thresholds. And on a side note, this directive has also been amended, so there are changes to these thresholds. But these thresholds decide when a company can be considered micro or small. But what they've done now is they said, even if the company as a whole is considered large or medium-sized, if the activities related to the primary operator activities, so the growing and harvesting of a relevant commodity, if those activities fall within the thresholds of micro and small, then they can be considered as a micro or small primary operator and benefit from the reduced obligations. The question came up yesterday a few times, how does a company know if the actual company is large, but there's parts of the operations are related to the primary operator activities? How do they know when they fall under these thresholds? I don't think we have an answer to that. That's more of an accounting or internal decisions that have to be made. How can the company define that these parts of the activities fit into those thresholds? So maybe the net turnover for those activities specifically are lower, and the employees relating to those activities are also within the thresholds of a micro or small company. So just to note that. Then let's move to the obligations. Again, in theory, it could also, a UK company or a non-EU company could also be considered as a micro and small primary operator if they were to place a relevant product directly on the EU market. This might be relevant specifically with a Northern Ireland scenario. But micro and small primary operators are still operators, so they need to exercise due diligence. That means they need to collect all of the information under Article 9. So this includes the product description, this includes evidence that the product was produced legally and deforestation-free, and it also includes certain information on the origin of the product. I'll get into a little bit more of detail in a moment. Of course, since these micro and small primary operators are based in low-risk countries, simplified due diligence applies to them. So they will normally not be required to conduct a formal risk assessment or risk mitigation process. Then they need to submit what is called a simplified declaration. This is a simplified version of the due diligence statement. It includes the same kind of information. So, of course, the operator name, the address, and if available, the EUDR number. It includes the HS code, a product description, the trade name. Here, an interesting point compared to the due diligence statement, they only need a one-time estimated annual quantity of the product. So it seems like they do not need to reassess the quantity each year like in the due diligence statement. So this is a one-time estimated quantity. As for the place of production, they of course need the country of production. They can submit geolocation, but the micro and small primary operator can optionally also submit the postal address of the plot of land or the place where the cattle were raised. So this specific operator does not need to submit geolocation. But just to clarify, this does not apply to any other operator. And in general, all of the changes in the amendments do not impact importers to the EU, regardless of size. All of the regular importers need to still exercise due diligence, submit a due diligence statement. One more note on the simplified declaration. They define it as a one-time simplified declaration. The question also came yesterday, does this mean it's one time per year? The way we understand and how we read the amendments is that this is a one-time ever thing. Because also in the in the text for the regular EUDR, the due diligence statement does not refer to being one time annually. It just says they need to submit it. Here they specify that it's a one time. So at the moment, we're assuming this means one time ever. Submit it once and then never again. This is also something we may see clarified in a future FAQ or guidance. Then finally, they also need to share, like any other operator, the declaration identifiers with downstream actors. A declaration identifier is just the equivalent of a reference number. So it's generated whenever they submit this to the information system. Then I'd like to move on to the downstream actors. I say downstream actors to include both downstream operators and traders, just because the obligations are the same. I'm just going to pull up everything here because I think in the most, for non-EU companies, this is not relevant because a non-EU company would never be a downstream actor, or it's very unlikely that they would be. The main change is they do not need to submit a due diligence statement anymore at all. In the past, they were still required to do this and they would have to reference the previous statements. This has all been removed. There is no more referencing of previous statements. Any or no downstream actor needs to submit a due diligence statement anymore. They still need to register in the information system and they're required to create an account, but they don't have to submit anything. Before they place on the market or make available or export, they need to have basic information on their suppliers. I mean, this is really nothing that I don't think a company wouldn't have already, right? This is the name, the trade name, the postal address, and email address of the company. And here, the point below, this is important. This is also relevant to non-EU companies. And we'll have an example later where I'll get back to this. But some downstream actors will be required to collect the due diligence statement reference numbers or the simplified declaration identifiers. However, this only applies to the first downstream operator in a given supply chain. So only when the downstream operator's supplier is an operator, so a company that is importing or an EU producer, only then do they need to collect and maintain and keep these reference numbers. There's one more slide after this just to visualize that. Beyond that, the downstream actor really doesn't need to do much at all, if anything. Of course, they need to inform competent authorities or downstream actors if there's any non-compliance in their products. They're also required to verify that due diligence was exercised if they're made aware of concerns that there might be non-compliance. We assume, based on existing FAQs, that this just means that the company will check in the information system if the due diligence statement was submitted and is valid, which can be done with the reference number. So that's why they need to keep the reference number, so that in case of substantiated concerns, they can just check in the information system to see if it's valid or not. So here, just to show again, just a very basic, simple supply chain, just to show who needs to submit and who needs to keep the reference numbers. In this scenario, I don't know if you're able to see my mouse. I'm assuming you can.
I can't seem to see your mouse.
Never mind, we'll just have to try and follow along. So the importer in this case is the operator, right? They need to submit a due diligence statement and they need to pass on the reference numbers. Now, any company this importer sells to, in this case, we have a manufacturer or retailer, they are considered the first downstream operator or trader. They don't need to submit a due diligence statement, but they need to keep that reference number. Here in this scenario, it's just one company, but of course, this could be 2 or 3 or even more companies. Basically, the first company that this importer sells to will act as the first downstream actor and will need to keep the reference numbers. But any company further down, the second, third, or fourth downstream operator, don't need to submit statements and don't need to collect reference numbers. So this is what we get from the amendments. All clear and all simplified for EU companies. Only the first downstream operator needs to collect them, and that's fine and everything. But the question still remains, what about companies outside of the EU? What if something is exported? How do the reference numbers need to be shared? And I just have it's really just one scenario. This one is just to clarify again, if the product is harvested outside of the EU, so in this scenario, forest in China, and it sells the products to the UK, which then go into the EU, nothing changes in this scenario. We could, of course, replace China with any other third country. The point is just, if your supply chain looks anything like this, where a product is harvested outside of the EU, everything remains as it was before the amendments. There are no changes. So just to point that out. Now, sorry, there's a lot going on this slide. It's maybe also a bit overcomplicated. Let's just try and we'll start with the forest in the EU, who is the operator, right? They harvest the timber and they place it on the market by selling to a processor and manufacturer. This processor and manufacturer act as a downstream operator. As a first downstream operator, and they export the product outside of the EU. We don't have to, it doesn't matter if the company they sell to is in the UK or in China, or if it goes through multiple countries. Of course, it makes it more complicated, but for the sake of this scenario, it's just being exported. It goes through different hands, and things happen to the product, and it's being changed. And at some point, it re-enters the EU. So now the question, well, the first question that we kind of ask ourselves is, how does the Commission actually define this kind of scenario? Because of course, they have clarified and they have talked about in the FAQs about re-importing. I think to us, it's not clear at this point how the EU or how the Commission defines re-importing under the EUDR. So would they define this as or the way you kind of read it from the FAQ, it says that if a product is being exported from the EU and then later it's released for free circulation, so imported into the EU again, this is a re-import. I think from a customs perspective, this might not be quite the case. Just again, we're not customs experts here. This is just kind of how we understand the process. But from a customs perspective, the exporting company knows when a product will be re-imported, and they will declare that this product will be re-imported. And then there's a specific customs code for this. And also the product can't really be changed at all, or only to a very small extent before it enters back into the EU. So that's just a bit unclear to us how the Commission envisions this re-importing when they talk about it. If we assume that this is what they mean when they refer to re-importing, maybe I'll start with just what we know. So we know from the FAQ that re-importing is considered downstream activity. So in this case, if this is considered re-importing, the importer in the EU, the second downstream operator, yes, they are a downstream operator because it's a re-import and it's a downstream activity. We know also that they're not required to submit a due diligence statement because they're downstream. We also know that only the first downstream operator is required to keep the reference numbers. So in this scenario, there would be no sharing of reference numbers required because it's the reference number has already been shared by the operator within the EU. Of course, we could imagine that it's the forest in the EU, the operator in the EU, that is exporting directly. And then in theory, the first importer in the EU would be the first downstream operator. And then kind of the question arises, is the EU exporter required to share the reference number with the re-importer, which is really complicates things because that would require, of course, that the reference numbers are shared throughout the supply chain in the UK. It's kind of, it's not clear to us. Unfortunately, we don't have an answer to this. It's, I think, quite clear that when they made the amendments, they did not take into consideration any kind of outside of EU scenario. It was very clearly just targeted to reduce obligations for EU companies. We have a set of questions related to this scenario, which we'll be submitting to the Commission by the end of the week. And we know that other companies are submitting the same. So we are expecting clarity from the EU on this topic, either clarifying clearly what constitutes a re-import under the EUDR, or how will the sharing of reference numbers be conducted. I think it's unlikely, or it's not likely. It can't happen that there will be a requirement for companies outside of the EU to share reference numbers. Also only in the one scenario where it's an operator exporting, which may not even be that common. So I think that's quite unlikely. Sorry, I'm just looking through my notes just to see if I covered everything I wanted to say about this. There's quite a lot of questions that go into this. Yeah, I think the main question would be, if this is considered a re-import, how does the importer, if they're a first downstream operator, how do they receive the reference numbers? And also, how do they know that they're a re-importer? So unless it's the same company exporting and then re-importing, how does the company in the EU which is re-importing know that they're a downstream operator in the first place? In theory, they might not. So they would start the whole process of exercising due diligence. They'd collect the geolocation, and then they might see, oh, the country of harvest is actually in the EU. So we're downstream. So we're eligible to downstream operator obligations. It's all unclear. Unfortunately, I don't have any answers to this. This is just something we'll have to wait and see how the EU or how the Commission handles this. There is one scenario as well. There's already existing the conventional, so-called conventional reference number. This is used in cases, currently it's used in cases for products being placed on the market or exported or re-imported that were placed on the market in the transitional period. So in the time between entry into force and date of application, of course, those products aren't in scope. So when those are exported and re-imported, operators can use a conventional reference number, which is just a reference number with a lot of nines. This might be an option that they explore. They might introduce another similar reference number like that, which can be used when the company realizes they're actually downstream. We don't know yet. We'll see. Of course, just to mention again, even if so in this specific scenario, this example supply chain, we see also there's a forest in the UK which is selling to a processor manufacturer. So the importer would have to, if the product that they are importing contains material that doesn't come from the EU, they would of course need to exercise due diligence on that material. So that complicates the whole thing. And then we kind of get back to the initial point, being that if our understanding is correct, then under how customs defines a re-import, it doesn't allow the product to be changed in that way. That would just be a regular import. So we'll really have to see how the Commission defines this. I think there's nothing more I can say to that. I will just keep repeating myself. I will then pass it back over to David. You're muted, David.
Yeah, you can hear me now. So we have just a few slides, like 5 slides. It's nice to see some questions coming in. I think Tim will have we can go through those. So firstly, just obviously Preferred by Nature is helping companies in different ways. And we have a little bit of a sort of an open source approach. So when we develop tools, we try to make these freely available through our website. So there's kind of a list here on the left, and I'll talk to some of these. I think let's just move to the next slide. So the first is basically our free self-assessment tool that can help a company determine or an actor determine whether the regulation the EUDR applies to their activities and what obligations they may have. This has now been updated to the amending regulation. So we just communicated on this, I think, just no more than 2 weeks ago. I think Tim was doing quite a lot of updating work to the previous version. So we're now on the 4th or the 5th iteration. But the idea is that it's a survey tool that you can just go through and ask and answer different questions about your operations and activities. And we try to provide some, an indication at the end as to what is your position in terms of whether you are an operator or a trader or a downstream operator, etc. And to clarify your activities. This is something it's used by companies. Some companies share it with their suppliers or their buyers, their network. Sometimes, if it helps, everyone to get a sort of a better picture of where they stand. Do we have it in other languages yet? I think they're coming, right, Tim?
Currently, only English and German.
Right.
Okay. I think we're waiting for the simplification review in April before we translate everything and then have to translate everything again in April.
Okay. Next is our due diligence toolkit. This was in fact, this is another sort of free resource. It's a set of, I think, 24 different tools, guidance documents in the form of PDFs, Excels, Word documents. The toolkit draws on Preferred by Nature sustainability framework, which is just our framework for sort of integrating sustainability principles into commodity due diligence for commodities. It's it's also naturally aligned with Preferred by Nature certification, which is a risk-based certification scheme that I'll talk a little bit in the next slide, I think. But just to say that we have our sustainability framework and our certification scheme is at least aligned with the due diligence requirements of the EUDR. So we have throughout these documents, it's basically a starting set of tools and templates for implementing a due diligence system. And throughout the documents, you'll see a little sort of EU flags, and we'll include elements or provide guidance or clarifications around compliance or alignment with the EUDR. Companies can, this is something we did for the EU timber regulation, more than 10 years ago, and we've done kind of the same for the EUDR. Companies can take these tools and use them as a starting point if that's where they are in their sort of journey towards alignment with the EUDR, or they can look at what they have and then rob, steal, adapt, elements of the toolkit to their needs, basically. So it's completely available for however you want to use it. There's like 5 different sections: system setup, information, supply chains, assessing risks. They're just sort of buckets of tools for specific tasks. Next slide. Tim, is just to mention Preferred by Nature certification. So, we are a certification body for many relevant, sort of EUDR relevant certification schemes that relate to timber, so PFC, FSC, but also Rainforest Alliance certified, RSPO for palm oil, etc. We do have our own certification. It's obviously slightly different in its approach. It certifies at the forest or farm level, but also we have a due diligence standard and set of kind of requirements. And we're trying, we've had this now for 2 or 3 years, but we're just in the process of revising our standards. So we'll try to make it more clear for companies that want to use our due diligence certification approach to either demonstrate alignment or, for themselves internally or to their buyers, their alignment with the regulations. So we're trying to pull all of the EUDR relevant requirements into one document, just so it's a bit clearer in that respect. But it's there again. It's available for review, for consultation, if you wish. Next slide. I think it's the second last. So many of you may be aware of our activities in relation to developing risk assessments. These we host on our open source repository for risk information. We call it the Sourcing Hub. There's a lot happening here within Preferred by Nature. We would like to, and we are doing, we're engaged in a whole bunch of different activities to try to actually build on our risk assessment work to cover like a wider set of legality and sustainability criteria, if you like, and also to sort of expand more fully out our risk assessment work. So it's not just covering timber for them, which is for the most part what you'll find today on the Sourcing Hub, but other commodities as well. We did set up an organization called the Risk Information Alliance. This is just an initiative among certification bodies, at least for now, to try and come together and say, well, if we're all doing risk assessments or providing risk assessment support for our stakeholders, is there any way that we can do this in a more efficient and coordinated way? So watch this space. We'll see what comes out of that. Then the last slide, I think, Tim, if you want to comment on this, other than to say, beyond certification, we have a separate sort of a firewalled and separate part of what we do, which is what we call sustainability advisory. And this is where a lot of our support work for companies in relation to the EU timber regulation developed out of, and now the EU deforestation regulation. So it was really just about supporting companies, not necessarily, perhaps on the whole, kind of all of their due diligence activities, but often just on one or other element of their due diligence, perhaps risk assessment, accessing information, mapping supply chains, or whatever the element is, and supporting different companies to strengthen their systems, basically.